democracies require a longer time horizon. They require a commitment to what is called repeat play, that, okay, I may lose today, but in 2 years I'm going to win, and then I'm going to be back. When the people in the system lose faith in repeat play, then all of a sudden they play for what can I get today? And we've seen that in the United States.
我是范琪斐，
陆莎莎，
欢迎收看《斐姨所思》。好，那今天阿姨想知道呢，我们有一个很特别的客人哦，他是远从美国来的，名字叫什么
？Samuel
Issacharoff，right？ 我都叫他 Samuel 啦，哈，就比较简单这样子。
教授人很客气啊，都说叫他。
对对对，然后他就是纽约大学的法学教授哦，他是非常非常大牌的宪法学教授。然后这一次他来台湾，其实是受中研院的邀请，来看看我们台湾。我们台湾最近不是有很多这个宪政改革嘛，就是国会改革法案啊，在进行很多跟宪政相关的这个改变这样子，所以就请他特地来看一看，想听听他的意见。然后他是专门到各国去做很多这样子的演讲啊，去做观察的。那他在我们还也特地去了一场他在台大的演讲哦，我跟路易莎莎还有梅乐蒂，我们3个人都去了这样。然后他在演讲里面就有提到，最近墨西哥不是把所有的这个法官改成民选了吗？那他们在讨论的过程里面的时候呢 ，Samuel 也去了啊，他也被邀请去听听他们打算怎么做啊，这些东西这样子。所以说他是专门在做就是宪法各国的这个宪法的这个研究的。然后那后来呢，我想说，那是苏彥图教授帮我们拉的线嘛，啊，他就说啊，这位这个是宪法学大师来台湾啊，你们有没有兴趣访问他？我就想说，当然有兴趣啊，可是他真的会来吗？然后没想到我们一约以后就真的约到了，
而且我们敲到了一个他在起飞前的时间。
对，然后他真的这位教授真的是人非常好啊，他年纪很大，大概我想应该有
过70岁，
应该有过70岁这样子。可是他来台湾，就是他真的跟蛮多人谈过哦，所以那个时候我们其实在设计访纲的时候，我本来还有点担心他不愿意提他在台湾就是观察到了现象，因为很多教授会比较保守一点。可是所以我们的访纲上面其实提了很多是比较 general 的问题这样子。可是来了以后我问他，他就问什么答什么，
知无不言。
知无不言这样，我觉得蛮厉害的。我觉得他的这个背景，我还是交给路易莎莎来跟大家仔细讲一下好了。
好，那 Issacharoff 教授呢，他其实是耶鲁毕业的。那他毕业之后呢，他其实一开始在教书之前，他其实就是主要是在这个美国这个选务上面的这种诉讼上面，他是这边的诉讼律师。那其实他也在2016年的时候，在奥巴马的团队担任这个法律的这个可以算是顾问团，就是有这样的一群律师去协助，当各州出现这样子的选务纠纷或者怎么样的时候，协助他们进行法律的辅助跟这个咨询。那之后他就进到纽约大学教书，那他教的就是他专注在宪法跟这个民主法治上面。中研院形容是他是这个宪法学者里面的巨擘之一。
对。那所以呢，我们既然请他来了，我最想要知道就是说，我们台湾的民主还好吗？从他的角度来看，就是我们台湾的这个民主施行到现在来讲呢，他看起来给我们评个分数这样子，说我们做了好不好啊？这是第一个问题。那第二个问题呢，也是最近因为国会改革法案的关系嘛，然后尤其是大法官最近不是这个死刑的释宪也出来了吗？很多人就会讲说，这些大法官都是民进党总统任命的啦，所以很不公平啦。甚至还有我听过还有人说，干脆不要大法官好了，还说这些大法官也没有民选出来的，凭什么做这么重大的决定啊？那好，那所以我都想要听听这位宪法学的大师他怎么看他怎么看我们现在面对的这些问题。好，那么在听这个 Samuel 怎么讲之前呢，我们先也为自己做个广告。 OK， 好，那就是我们美选的募资啦啊。那我们在10月2号那天针对美国副总统的辩论，我们会再做一次直播。然后这一次呢，我们还请到了李四端来跟我跟敏迪还有可心我们4个人，然后这个路易莎莎就被挤出去了
太多麦克风，
因为人太多了。 OK， 然后呢，所以呢就会变成四端来这样子，然后我们会一起跟大家讨论就这一次的辩论。那这一次对于已经订阅的这个会员呢，我们有一个特殊的服务就是在辩论当下，其实我们 在上一次这个总统辩论的时候呢，我们其实没有把我们这个在现场的沟通的声音，
中间麦克是关起来的，
我们是关起来的。但是这一次呢，已经参加募资的朋友们呢，我们就会开放我们在现场里面讲一些垃圾话啦，讲一些干话，这个过程呢，我们会放出来给大家听啊，就是
漏音，
对，听我们在讲什么。如果你有兴趣的话啦，那其实说实在，我觉得大家应该认真看辩论才对。干嘛听我们讲垃圾话啊？可是我觉得，如果说会员有兴趣的话呢 ，Why not？ OK， 也可以听听我们在讲什么这样子。好，那所以如果想要听我们讲什么干话的话，非常欢迎赶快去参加募资，你就可以听得到了OK， 好，那现在呢，我们就来听听 Samuel 怎么讲我们台湾的宪政改革吧。So you have been in Taiwan for a while now. I know you've been talking to a lot of people. So I'd like to know, what do you hear here?
Well, I hear two things. On the one hand, I hear a great deal of pride in the stability of Taiwan, the internal political stability, the economic transformation, particularly of the last 10 years, is dramatic. And invariably, at some point, the conversation turns to China. And there is no escaping the impact of China in Taiwan. Part of it was unanticipated to me. So, for example, your government institutions don't have connections to the outside world the way that other places have because of the lack of diplomatic status and because of the pressures of China on other governments around the world. It is a little more difficult for Taiwanese institutions of academic scholars to be able to engage as freely because they can't officially be part of international bodies. And I was struck by how big a price that exacts on people here.
So under this kind of circumstances, how do you feel we are doing with our democracy?
Well, I think that all things being equal, it's very good. We have a joke in the United States. It's a very bad joke, but it's our President Lincoln was shot during a play in Washington, D.C., assassinated. And we say, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? And the humor is, who pays attention to the play when you have such a cataclysmic event? And the problem is that you don't know whether you are in a cataclysmic relation. And so you have to live your lives. And what is apparent here is that you have a thriving political culture. You have huge political debates at every level, from domestic policy all the way to constitutional law. And I was struck by the vibrancy of the constitutional debates here, but always in the shadow of China.
So when we are talking about like the erosion of democracy, okay, so do you see any signs of that in Taiwan?
It's too soon to tell. What Taiwan has that is very heartening at this point in the democratic world is it has, as best I can tell, free and fair elections. It has vigorous political dissent with no evidence of suppression of parties or viewpoints. And it has stable institutions, meaning that the main political parties are mass parties. They have mass support. One controls the presidency, one controls the legislature. That creates political tension, but that's the political tension of a healthy democracy. So most of the problems around the world are not reflected in Taiwan. Most of the democratic countries in the world face two primary problems. One is the political parties have collapsed, And second, and related, the legislature is failing as an institution. So increasingly, democracies are controlled by the executive, and oftentimes by what we call illiberal executives, Orban, Kaczynski, Modi, people who try to use their elected position to consolidate power and to shut down democratic competition. I don't see that in Taiwan. And so that's the sign of, at this point, a very vigorous, healthy democracy, a very new one, because really it's only 30 years old. And so you really have a consolidation of a vibrant new democracy.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that most of the democracies, the danger of it is actually occurring from internal, right? It's actually not from external pressure. But I have to say that a lot of the time, it's very hard to tell which is internal, which is external.
I think this is the price of being a democracy. The situation in Taiwan reminds me a great deal of the pressures felt around the world before 1989, when we still lived in the Cold War, before the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. A lot of things that looked like internal political pressures oftentimes were really great power politics being played out locally. And so in South Africa, the National Party, the Apartheid Party, was heavily backed by the United States and the West, simply as a matter of the Cold War. The ANC, the African National Congress, Mandela's party, was heavily backed by the Soviet Union as part of great power politics. When the Berlin Wall fell in '89, all of a sudden these parties were left to their own devices. And what one found was that there was a reconciliation and a transformation once you took the pressure of the great powers off. This was reflected also in many countries, including the United States, in the fear of communism, that we had a communist party, which was an ideological party. It had viewpoints. It agitated somewhat, but not too menacingly, and yet at the same time, it was expressing the interests of the Soviet Union. How do you deal with that? I think the answer is you have to deal with it for as long as you can. You have to deal with it internally as a matter of democratic politics. And one of the principles that has emerged, not just in the United States, but in the European Union and many other places, is that unless a party is an imminent danger, what in the United States constitutional law we call a clear and present danger, we have to tolerate that there may be a mix. And so certainly if
but
you're...
How do you define the clear and present danger?
If they try to agitate for violence, if they try to overthrow the government, if they actively try to sabotage the institutions of the society. It is not an easy line, but when you asked before about expanding the powers of the Congress here, of the legislature, the party that's primarily agitating for that is the KMT. The KMT is a mass institution. It has support of a very large number of Taiwanese people. You could not possibly eliminate the KMT from politics in Taiwan and pretend to be a democracy any longer. That would be a coup. It would require military action, and that would be the end of the Taiwanese experiment in democracy. So I understand your question that it's not a bright line. I think that democracies have to tolerate a margin of insecurity as a condition of their existence.
There are already people saying that. Why should we trust the Chief Justice? Why should we trust the Supreme Court Justice decision? They are appointed by one party, one party's president. Their credibility is in doubt. Does that qualify as, and they are even talking about paralyze the Supreme Court. Does that qualify for what you said?
No, I think I had the privilege of going to address your constitutional court here. Your constitutional court is a serious judicial institution. It has handed down important decisions that show it is nobody's fool in the political domain. When I teach comparative constitutional law or when I write about it, there's a decision of your court from 1999-2000 called Interpretation Number 499, which was a bold decision which prevented the KMT government from capturing permanent positions in the legislative yuan. That is exactly the role that courts should play. They shouldn't simply be the political will of the moment. They have to stand back. Your constitutional court's decision on same-sex marriage is a tremendous decision and also very wise because it invited the yuan to draft legislation to meet the needs of same-sex couples in Taiwan. So yes, there are always people who want the immediate, who say, aha, I didn't get what I wanted from the court, or I know that this justice, when he was in university, was in this political party or that political party. But that's not the measure. The measure is, does the institution have integrity? And I think that there is high confidence in Taiwan, basically in the institutions.
But there are people saying that they are, because the half of the justice, their terms will be expired in October. So there are people talking about we're just not going to let you pass the new appointees. So the Supreme Court will be paralyzed.
That's dangerous. That's dangerous. And we confront that in the United States because we have a system in which the legislature has to approve executive appointments, nominations to our courts. We have the same, it's a little bit different, but it's in its basic structure, it's the same. And we have had a couple of occasions recently where the Senate has rebelled and refused to consider nominations. It seems that we've passed that and that we're okay for the moment. But if that becomes a permanent feature, then the system won't work. There has to be political goodwill. At some point, you can't prohibit everything. You can't anticipate everything in the Constitution. You have to rely on even people who are ardent partisans. You have to rely on some kind of goodwill.
But when they step into politics, I really sense their changes. They become distrustful. So how do we gain trust when we have a political system that encourage competition like that?
Well, this is a great question. So there's a saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's Lord Acton. And so people get close to power and something happens to them. And the answer has always been in democracies that you have to create institutions so that ambition counters ambition. That's the phrase from James Madison in our Federalist Papers in the United States. And so the institutions compete, and that's why political parties are so important, because ultimately the goodwill of people is important, but you can't just rely on goodwill. James Madison, our greatest political theorist, also had another expression, which is, if men were angels, we wouldn't need any of these institutions. But we understand the corrupting influence of power and politics, and so we check it through institutions, and that's why it's critically important that your constitutional court continue to function, that the justices be allowed to assume offices, that the normal rotations take place. You have an advantage in Taiwan that your constitutional court actually has a very short tenure as a justice. It's only 8 years. It means there's a rotation. I think the best court in terms of its structure is the German Constitutional Court, which has 18 justices divided between 2 chambers, and they serve for 18 years. And so it means that every year two of them step off. And so that means that every 2 years, rather, which means that the parliament, the Bundestag, has to replace them, but it's not cataclysmic. You have a problem now because so many of your justices are stepping down this fall. But in general, if you do it incrementally like that, and everybody knows that there will be another appointment next year or the year after, and then another one, and then another one, it lowers the temperature on constitutional court appointments. Right now, there's a lot of debates on, for example, restructuring government power and things like that. And so everybody is very focused on the Constitutional Court. And the fact that you have so many justices stepping down right now raises the temperature. It's inevitable.
China really doesn't like us to change our constitution. We cannot really go through the regular constitution process. So we just fix a lower law, and then so we can achieve that goal. Okay, so the thing is, to pass a lower level law, you only need a simple majority. That makes me very uncomfortable. What do you think about that?
I think that every constitution requires stability and some independence from immediate politics. The way that most constitutions do it is by supermajorities of one kind or another. Some European countries allow the legislature to do it, but they require 2 votes of the legislature in successive years, so there's been an election in between. So that puts a time filter on it rather than a supermajority filter on it. The problem in Taiwan is that, including for international relations reasons, your constitution was never approved by the people. And so there was never a sense that this was a declaration of national entity as such. And so you created a mechanism to allow popular participation through the amendment process and through the approval of amendments. You then created a supermajority, which is typical of constitutions around the world. I think your supermajority is too high, because your supermajority is a majority of the population, not a majority of voters. And in most democracies, how many people really participate? In the United States, it's 60%. In a very contested year, it may go near 70%. But if you required a majority of all people, that means you already start with 30% against because they're not voting. And that's the problem in Taiwan. At the same time, it's a good thing that as much as possible be put into the domain of politics and be passed through ordinary legislation, because that's not permanent, because that if the people change their will, if the elections change, then that can be changed also. The critical thing is that the democratic process itself cannot be up for a vote every time. It can't be that all of a sudden we take away money from the opposition because the majority has 50% plus 1.
But the problem is that the party now has a majority in the Congress. They are going to change the rule in favor of their way, and then when they lose the election, they say that 2 years later they lose the election. When next people coming in, they are going to change the rules again.
Yes,
that's what's bothering me. I said, you cannot do this to our constitutional system.
We have the same problem in the United States that. One of the I have a book that just came out, Democracy Unmoored, and one of the main points I make there is that democracies require a longer time horizon. They require a commitment to what is called repeat play, that, okay, I may lose today, but in 2 years I'm going to win, and then I'm going to be back. When the people in the system lose faith in repeat play, then all of a sudden they play for what can I get today? And we've seen that in the United States, for example. We've had a number of very disturbing trends. I'll give you one example. In the state of North Carolina, the Republicans controlled the governor. The governor was a Republican, and then a Democrat was going to become governor. but the Republicans still had the legislature. So they passed laws to take away powers of the governor, short term. And in another state, Arizona, they said, we're taking away power from the attorney general because it was a Democrat who was elected, but only for 2 years. It will automatically sunset, expire in 2 years. Why? Because they didn't know who was going to be elected in 2 years.
That's cheating.
It is cheating, and it's the death of democracy, because then you try to rig the system instead of playing my ideas versus yours. I want more welfare payments. I want fewer welfare payments. I want more immigration. I want less immigration. That's politics. Instead of playing on that, you play on manipulation of the system.
Okay, so what do we do when that happens?
What you do when that happens is you hope that there are institutions that are not captured that are points of resistance. And so here are some institutions that have been important in the United States, for example. The courts. The courts tend to be slower. It's harder to capture the courts. So they serve as a brake on these kinds of impulses. So you get a great deal of litigation over these questions. And I've been a litigator in many of these kinds of cases in the United States. Second, you get other institutions which require stability. And one of them is business institutions that don't like the idea that the rules can be manipulated, because then you don't get investment, you don't get all sorts of important things. I wrote an article a couple of years ago with Robert Rubin, who used to be the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States. And the point we made in that article was that if you think you can manipulate the electoral system by changing institutions, by compromising institutions, the impact will not just be in the political domain, it will also be on the foreign credit of the United States, on the standing of the dollar as the most important currency in the world, because part of the economic power of the United States depends on the stability of perceived stability of institutions. I think the same thing is true in Taiwan. Your wealth is the product of being at the front of business and technology around the world. I mean, that has transformed Taiwan. If your courts are seen as compromised, if your central bank is seen as compromised, if you can't trust in the integrity of contracts because judges are compromised, it's not just the legal system that will suffer, your business community will suffer. And they should be a voice of caution on these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. So we talk about the importance of the institution, right? How do we reinforce the trust to the institution?
That's a very hard question, because institutional trust is something that builds up over time and can be destroyed very quickly. And we are in a period where there is high level of citizen distrust of institutions, perhaps a little less here in Taiwan, but generally in all democratic countries. The challenge is to make the institutions perform and be perceived as performing for the citizens. The answer, I think, has to be that they have to perform and make people's lives better, and then you have trust. But absent that, that's really one of the costs. I think that if I could just add one thing to that, the difficulty is that we have built democracies for the last 200 years based upon stable institutions, churches, trade unions, small business associations, farmers groups, and use those to feed into stable political parties. That world is ending. We don't have trade unions in most countries of meaningful size. We don't have major church participation anymore. We don't have that kind of collective organization. And so democratic politics going into the next era is going to look different. We don't quite know how it's going to be organized. That's the real challenge to democracy. And part of it is figuring out which institutions will emerge that will have credibility and can be seen as delivering hope and meaningful benefits to people's lives.
When Brexit happened, I was actually in UK covering the story. I have to say that before the vote, like the media, the intellectuals, I mean, everybody go out and then try to persuade the public. And this is not good for you. This is so damaging. This is not right. Don't believe in those lies. But, and yet, they won. Anyway, the Brexit people won. So, I mean, I could feel the frustration of the intellectuals. I mean,
yes,
I try everything.
But all my English friends are people who live in London or are in the universities like Oxford and Cambridge, and they didn't know anybody who was in favor of Brexit. The people in favor of Brexit were in the small towns in the Midlands. They were in northern England. They were in places that had been left behind. And I think that it's a big danger in all societies to listen to the intellectuals talk about the people, because by and large they don't know anybody who is the people. And we have to be humble about that. They have no idea what's in local conversations. They have no idea about the social media exchanges among people who are outside the intellectual classes, and that's a real danger.
So, but I think I have a problem when we communicate with the public. There are people just doesn't respect that anymore, because I think the anti-establishment, the sentiment is very strong right now.
2024 has been called by the Financial Times the year of elections. We had 80 major elections between the end of 2023 and this November, leading up to the American elections, in which the governments of countries were up for elections. Now, there's some very good news in this, in that the elections worked. They were by and large respected. Leave aside Venezuela, leave aside Iran, but basically they were respected. And overwhelmingly, except in Mexico and Taiwan, the will of the people was what we call throw the bums out. They just hate whoever's in power. So in every country, they voted against the established party. They voted against Modi for the first time in India. They voted against Kaczynski's party in Poland. They voted against Macron's party. They voted against the Tories in Britain. Didn't matter where, it was a vote against. And in some ways, that's very healthy, because the definition of a democracy is that you can vote people out of office and that the will of the people will be respected. So that's great. The problem is that what they voted for was chaotic. That's the bad side. So you're absolutely right that there's a distrust of those in power. And the question is why? I think part of it is that in most of the democracies, working people have not been protected, have not been doing well. They have felt the burdens of globalization. And in those circumstances, they turn against whoever's in charge. You betrayed me. You've let me down. And that sentiment is very powerful. Now, here's the good side. In longer-term democracies, like in the United States, this is not the first time we've encountered this. And it tends to rise, and then these populist angers burn themselves out. Something comes along that changes it. The economy begins to perform better. Or sometimes there's a war, and so there's patriotism. Sometimes there's just a good period for whatever reason. I am from Argentina originally, and it was a tremendously uplifting national event when Argentina won the World Cup. Now, you'd think that that should not play out in the political domain, but it sure does. There's a sense of national pride and joy. It's very important for people to experience joy and as a part of their collective identity. not everybody can win the World Cup.
Exactly.
Is a problem.
That's a problem.
That's the problem.
But are there other ways?
Well, there are other ways. When the economy performs well, when there is pride in the Olympics, for example, things like that have a way of breaking the malaise. And I can't give you a formula for how to do that, but
I think the Brits are using monarchy. Do you agree? I mean,
yes, I think that it's interesting. There's a colleague of mine at the University of Chicago who has been looking at constitutional monarchies, and surprisingly, they are highly stable. Now, they tend to be in countries like Norway and Netherlands and Britain, which tend to be relatively stable democracies. But they have an interesting effect that when you have a king, and I leave aside Thailand and Malaysia, which are very complicated examples, but when you have a king, generally, you have somebody who is the symbol of the nation. And so a populist pretender, a Bolsonaro in Brazil or a Donald Trump in the United States cannot be the oracle of the nation because there's a king or a queen. And I never appreciated that before. I think I tend to be a person of the modern world, so a monarchy, that seems absurd to me. On the other hand, it was interesting that Elizabeth, especially at the end of her life, was a stabilizing figure in Britain. And I don't think you can just create a monarchy now to do that.
I actually think that we do have a problem of what you said, a constant and stable institution or power or national symbol. We do have a problem with that.
I think that every young democracy goes through this. If you look at the post-colonial period, every country that had to establish its independence had to figure out both its national identity, how you established institutions, how you got the people to recognize a national collective will, and most failed. If you go back to the United States, you had this problem at the beginning of the United States also. Who was our king? How were we going to govern? We were going to govern because of elections. Who was going to respect the elections? How were they going to be conducted? What did it mean to be an American when a significant part of the population fought on the side of the British? What do we do with the people who were still loyal to England? And this was an issue that was very difficult. We had, in the election of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the backers of Jefferson, the Federalists, deeply believed, the Anti-Federalists, deeply believed that John Adams was an agent of the British monarchy. And the backers of John Adams believed that Thomas Jefferson was an agent of the French, because the French were trying to expand into North America, and that was the time of the Revolution. And this was an uncertain time, and it took several elections. It took going through all sorts of national projects, expansion, to create a national identity. I'll give you one example. We talk about the United States, and it's interesting in English that when we say the United States, we speak in the singular. The United States is a country in North America. That was not the habit in the United States for the first 100 years. It was the United States are.
United States are.
Are, because it's plural states.
Okay.
And because it's plural states, it means that there were different political entities and there was no sense of a collective. It was only in Lincoln's second inaugural address where he used the term "the United States is," and that became the transformation into the recognition of a national entity. So you think these problems did not exist in the United States because we've been at this for several hundred years. but they certainly did at the beginning. You have to allow time for that. So I think that I understand the problems, but it does take time.
Patience.
Patience.
The way you would describe about the endurance of democracy, I think is a little bit like, like a healthy person might have a fever from time to time. You just have to go through the fever, and then you will be, we could just maybe you will be healthy again. But don't you sometimes worried that you might die in the period of the fever?
Of course. You worry about two things. You worry that the fever may be fatal because you never know at the beginning exactly what's going to happen. And you worry that somebody comes up with a cure that may be worse, so that I don't want leeches put on me if I have a fever, as we would have done 400 years ago. I don't want primitive responses that turn out to exacerbate the situation.
Yeah. So how do we know if this fever is fatal or not?
Wisdom, statesmanship. There is a problem. Every democracy has to face emergency circumstances. And sometimes it's COVID. Sometimes it's war. It is interesting that across the history of long-standing democracies, the United States and certainly Britain, what one finds is that there's exceptional periods when the government has to assume tremendous control. War. And after war, you get an expansion of democracy, not a contraction of it, because the war requires that people step up and perform a civic duty. They have to be, the men will be conscripted, the women have to work in the factories. This is the experience of 100 years ago. And what happens after war is that the franchise gets bigger. So in the 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars, the franchise expanded in Britain. In the United States after World War I, women are given the vote. And so healthy societies go through this process and actually come out stronger. And the difficulty is that it has to be confined, period. And so we did not come out stronger in the United States for the Vietnam War. It was too long, too caustic. We did not come out stronger, certainly for our disaster in Afghanistan. You have the difficulty with China, and you don't know what the end game is. You don't know where it plays out. It could be military, which would be catastrophic for everyone. More likely, it's this kind of simmering tension that is always there and never seems to, it's not obvious how we're going to get out of it.
Okay. The other thing is that when on our show, there are some Chinese people actually watch our show too. They always, one of the common complaints from that side is that this show, when we talk about Chinese system, is always like negative view of that. Okay.
I have been to China a number of times. Not in the last 8 years. It's become more difficult for a foreign scholar like myself to go there. Under Xi Jinping, things have gotten more constricted. When I go to China, I have to confess I'm awestruck by the transformation in one generation of a country of over 1 billion people that was brought into modern life. I'm stunned by the cities, by the way people live, by the infrastructure that's there. We have not built an airport in the United States since the late 1990s. We don't have the capacity to build a new airport. The politics are too difficult. We built an extension of 5 kilometers of the New York City subway, and that was the most expensive undertaking in the world. And 5 kilometers, 3 stops, that was our main contribution. the ability of the society to deliver that in such a short period of time through pretty good stewardship of the society, you have to admire China for that.
So do you believe that the democracy, the democratic system would prevail? I think it prevailed last time during the Cold War, yes. But do we still believe in that?
Well, I'd give two answers. First is Taiwan's a good example of a democracy that's functioning pretty well, and that has, while respecting the liberties of the people in the last 30 years, transformed the society for the better in many of these same ways and been very accountable for it. So there are exceptions in some countries. South Korea is like that also. I did some work about 20 years ago. I was drawn to the question of military capabilities. And it's interesting that democracies have always outperformed more tyrannical regimes militarily. And the question is why? Because you'd think that, if you have a dictatorship, it's already organized from the top down. What happens in autocracies, including in China today, is that there's no trust. So interestingly, for example, in the early days of the war between Russia and Ukraine, Russia would send troops to the front in the same way they did in World War II, with somebody standing behind them who will shoot them if they desert. And all the decisions made by generals who had to go to the front line because they did not have majors and corporals and colonels who they could trust. As a result, because of modern technology, Russia lost a lot of generals because they had to be brought to the front lines, and the Ukrainian snipers could pick them off. And one of the things that Xi Jinping did in consolidating power was to move against the local chieftains, Bojanlai and people like that, and did so on corruption grounds and other things like that. But it meant that there was now fear at the local level of leadership, which means, Beijing can't respond to, a question that the harvest is going bad in some province or something of that sort. It can't work that way. No society can be that rigid. So democracies still do better in terms of social trust, cohesion of national identity, things of that sort. But your earlier questions of what happens if we lose that, then all of a sudden you get loss of state capability, you get cynicism, you get disenchantment, and it's a big problem we have in the United States, and I think it's a big problem for.
So do you think we have this danger, like at one point we might really lose to the autocrats? People might say that I just prefer that system.
Yes. If you wanted somebody to come here to give guarantees that all things will turn out well, you got the wrong person. No, it's it would be nice if good always won and bad always lost, and we could guarantee that, and we know that if we're going through a bad period, the fever will always break. Sometimes we die. There is risk, and it is a difficult, we're in a difficult time right now because democracies are not doing well by and large, and there is massive disenchantment with the democratic process. I mean, look at what's happening in Europe. You're getting these parties coming that are organized around anger, and they are reorganized out of terrible movements, so that Marine Le Pen's party in France is the worst of the fascistic impulses after World War II. The AfD in Germany has ties to the Nazi past, unfortunately. Prime Minister Meloni's party in Italy is the descendant of Mussolini's party in some important sense. Now, sometimes they get better. Prime Minister Maloney has been extremely capable. She's turned out to be a very shrewd politician. And sometimes it's the beginning of the end, and you just don't know.
So this time, let's say, if Trump got, lose the election, I mean, if he got elected, I actually think that's less problem. Because, if he lose, and then he refused to concede, what would happen?
Before 2020, we'd never had a situation where a president didn't concede at the end, and where a president doesn't go to the inauguration of his successor. I mean, we'd never had that. We'd never had the systematic attack on our institutions that we had from Trump. And in 2020, the institutions held. In 2024, in many states, the institutions are weaker than they had been, so I can't guarantee that everything will work well. But I think that, but the question you're raising is a very serious one. If Trump narrowly loses, will the Republicans in the Congress permit the transfer of power to Vice President Harris? I could also ask the question, if Harris narrowly loses, will the Democrats?
Yes, I do worry about that too.
Yes, and it is a fair worry, because the key to democracy, as I said earlier, was repeat play, the sense that this year it's me, next year it'll be you, and so I don't want to play too much with the game because I want my chance the next time. If you lose that sense that we're in this for the long haul, then everybody plays short term. Those are the rules of the game. They may not be perfect, they may not be the ones we want, but it's the ones we're going to live by. I'm not so sure that there's that common faith anymore.
So when the common faith is broken, I have been asked this question so many times already. People are asking me, is United States going to have a civil war? Are we really talking about this?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because a civil war requires a breakdown of many institutions, not just partisan antagonism. It requires a breakdown of the military. It requires a breakdown of other kinds of civic institutions, and those are holding up well in the United States. And so I don't think that that's what's at stake.
This is the last question that I ask every guest.
Okay.
Okay. So if there's one message you want our audience to take home, to take away, what's that message going to be?
Well, for your audience, I would say this is my first time in Taiwan. I've written a little bit about Taiwan from outside, but I've never been here. This is a remarkably healthy society, and the growing pains of a new democracy, trying to figure out if the institutions that some of your institutions were created by the Kuomintang when it came here in the late 40s, and yeah, they don't feel right at this point. That's a question that all societies have to confront. We still have in the United States the Electoral College, which I was just describing, which is a crazy, archaic product of our politics of the late 18th century. But it's actually one of the better democratic cultures in the world right now, and seems for the moment to yield a high level of state competence and a pretty good way of living for the population. That should be a source of optimism.
I do wish that could be like the power you're talking about to be the constant of our democracy. I do hope that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. 我们讲一下 take away 好了。今天听 Samuel 在讲的时候，你有没有觉得有点像在上课？
确实，
我是真的觉得他对于虽然来了台湾的时间只有几天的时间哦，可是他真的是，我觉得他 知道他在问什么，我觉得他问对了问题，然后问对了人，进入状况的速度很快啦，我觉得应该这样讲啊。所以我在听他讲的时候，我觉得我的结论当然是，我觉得最重要的 take away 就是他一再强调说，我们必须要信任 institution， 就是这些所谓的机构啊，这些所谓的机构是，比如说像大法官。要相信大法官有他的公正性，
目前充满争议。
对，然后呢，另外一个你要信任中选会，
这有更大争议。
你要信任中选会，要维持它的公正性。当你质疑这两个的，当你质疑这两个机构的时候，民主其实是没有办法运作的。因为如果说没有大法官说最后的裁判的话，那我们要找谁做裁判呢？那如果没有中选会，你不信任中选会对选举的公正性的话，选举的结果是不会被尊重的。所以我不知道这样的情况之下，选举就是你的一个民主制度要怎么样能够进行。我其实我没有答案 ，OK？ 那是不是要进入一个无政府状态呢？
那我觉得要补充一下啦，我觉得其实范姐因为你有追问到嘛，就我们要怎么样增加这些民众对机构的信任度，因为毕竟这社会中就是有些对这些机构的攻击与不信任。那两个重点，第一个是我想教授他有提到，就是他目前觉得当我们在处理这种质疑的时候，我们必须要把它当成是民主内部的其中一个声音，我们要尽可能在以民主的状况之下去处理这样子，我们要忍受它，这是身为民主国家的一个代价，这是第一件他讲的。那他也讲到，那其实第二件事情就是他有讲到，就是这些机构。法院啊，司法也好，那这个中选会也好，那包含其实教授有讲到中央银行也好，那其实重点就在于你必须要让人民感觉到相信这个机构为我们做的事情是为社会整体的福利好。那我觉得这个是你要人民建立起信任的时候，你必须要让他们相信这个机构的存在不是为了向特定少数的政党服务，而是为了全体国民多数的福祉去服务。这件事情我觉得其实补充一下。
对，然后另外一个，我觉得大家应该，我说实在，我听了以后另外一个，我觉得我们台湾应该真的要为我们自己的民主很骄傲啦，因为我觉得台湾的情况的确是非常的困难，因为很多时候，比如说我们听到很多杂音的时候，我真的不知道那个压力到底是来自内部还是外部的，有时候你很难判断。因为在美国的话，其实他就在讲，像美国的对民主最大的威胁其实是来自内部嘛。但是我们的威胁，我说实在，有时候内部的声音跟外部的声音是分不清楚的。可是我们到如今，我觉得我们还是在运作啊，我们的民主还是在运作啊。即使在这么困难的情况之下，我们还是运作的不错 ，OK？
而且其实有潜力可循啦。就是教授在访谈里面有讲到，他说，其实在美国在刚建立的时候，其实尤其在前几次选举的时候，两边一边觉得对方是这个英国同路人，另外一边觉得对方是法国同路人，所以其实台湾在这样的情况之下很艰难，但是并不孤独，有潜力可循。大家如果对民主体制就是有信任，然后我们想要守护这样子的一个生活方式的话，其实我觉得应该是想的是，当你有质疑，你对这些机构的公正性有质疑的时候，我们应该是想的是，我们要怎么样让这个机构能够改善。比方说，其实教授就有讲到，那时候讲到任期的问题，有人说8年太长，有人说12年。比方说汤泽宗前大法官，他就说12年才够。那其实这个教授有讲到嘛 ，Issacharoff 教授有讲到，他说其实他觉得最好的是德国。他说德国是这样子，18个大法官，然后呢9个在不同的院，但因为还有2个不同层级的国会，然后呢每年我换2个。每2年换2个，你总共换9次嘛，你就不会像台湾这样子哦，突然4年一到有半数大法官要离任，就不会有一个这么大的波动。我觉得这是我们可以参考的。
对啦，反正就是我觉得好好改这个机构啦。然后我们也说人多，他也说嘛，人多有人多的好处，也有人多的坏处，人少有人少的好处，有人少的坏处嘛。我觉得现在是这样啦，这衣服已经穿在身上了 ，OK？ 我觉得就慢慢想办法改吧。
除非你要把衣服全部脱光，
对啊，那你全部脱光了以后，那你就没有衣服穿了嘛。
你会不会冻死？
对，你就没有衣服穿了嘛。OK， 好了，那今天我们的讨论就到这边了啊。那再提醒大家，10月2号的时候早上啊，我们会再做一次有关副总统辩论的讨论。那欢迎大家一起来参加。
有邀请李四端
前辈，对，李四端会来这样子。OK， 好，那如果喜欢我们节目的话，应该要
按着那个分享内。
好，谢谢大家。